Well, good afternoon and welcome to this special session of the International Studies Colloquium. I'm Allison Stanger, Director of the Rohatyn Center for International Affairs at Middlebury College, and it's my pleasure to have you here today and to welcome our speaker and introduce him. A little bit about the protocol here. It's familiar to many of you here, but for those of you who are new to us, lunch is served throughout the program, and we're quite informal, so you should feel free to go up and get coffee. Just do it quietly, so it's not disruptive, and we'll conclude promptly at 1:30. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce my former student, Irakly Areshidze. Both Irakly and his brother Georgi, who is in the back there, he's actually here, eating fruit salad, originally hail from Georgia. And both Areshidze brothers, I think, left quite a large mark on Middlebury College, and I know that I'm not the only faculty member who misses them. Following his graduation from Middlebury in 2000, Irakly was a visiting scholar at the Central Asia Caucasus Institute of the Johns Hopkins University School for Advanced International Studies. During that time, he co-founded the Partnership for Social Initiatives, a Georgia-based think tank. In 2003 to 2004, he was the deputy campaign manager and chief strategist for the New Rights Party, Georgia's main opposition party. Sometime thereafter, he joined the Boston Consulting Group and received a rigorous business school training, and from there went on to launch a very promising internet startup. He's actually taking a break from that kind of 24/7 existence to be with you here today. His writings appeared in many publications, including the Washington Post and the Christian Science Monitor. He's recently published a fine book, Democracy and Autocracy in Eurasia, Georgia in Transition, published with Michigan State University Press, and his talk today will be on that general topic. So please join me in welcoming Irakly Areshidze back to Middlebury College.
Thank you. I had a class with Professor Stanger in this room, like 8 years ago almost. And so a lot of memories in this room, and in general, coming to campus yesterday, it's been really emotional for me because there are very few things that mean as much to me as Middlebury does. And I oftentimes say that, A, I'm a walking advertisement for Middlebury because at the gym I only wear Middlebury clothes. And second, because every time I ever talk to somebody who's thinking about college, I can't say enough good things. And two, that everything I've done in my life has somehow been connected to the school since I've been gone. Professor Stanger talked about my career, and at almost every stage, something that related to Middlebury helped shape what I did. When I moved to DC to work on Georgia, I randomly met a man named Charles Fairbanks, who is a prominent scholar on the former Soviet Union. Well, the only reason I was able to develop a relationship with him was because Mr. Dry knew him from the time when they were both in graduate school at the University of Chicago. And then after I was done with Georgia and I needed to do something else, my best friend from college was at BCG, and he forced me to go work for BCG, which was a great thing. And then now together we started the software company. So I think it's really emotional to be here, and I'm really excited. And so thank you for inviting me, and I'm glad, and hopefully I'll make some sense of what I want to talk about. So my book, which is right here, and it's a little too thick, if you ask me, but the reason it's too thick is because I never had a chance to cut it because I was out of time, is about Georgian political history from 1991 through 2005. And it's partly a political kind of historical narrative with a lot of research and interviews with people, and then partly a personal narrative, almost like a biography of sorts, of my own work in Georgia. And so I couldn't talk about the whole book because it covers so much, and I was going to talk about 3 topics. Then Mr. Dry yesterday at dinner suggested that I should only talk about one and cover that well, and so I'm going to only talk about one topic, which is the infamous Rose Revolution that took place in Georgia in 2003. So I want to discuss what led to that event and then what happened after. it was a pretty big deal when it happened. I think, as I'll talk about in more detail, and so I think it's a pretty important topic in light of where we are as far as democracy promotion today. So as a lead-in to that, I want to give you a bit of a background for what the political environment was in Georgia in 2003 when the Rose Revolution happened, as a way of explaining why it took place and what it meant. And I'm going to do that by giving you my own story of post-graduation and how I got involved in Georgia. In 2001, I was working at a company called the Corporate Executive Board in DC, and I really couldn't stay my job. So I needed to do something else. I found some business people in Georgia who were kind enough to give me some funding to work on shaping the opinion of Washington policymakers and opinion makers on Georgia. And so that's how I ended up at SAIS. And I was probably a very small fish in a pond of a bunch of other much more prominent people who were trying to focus the Bush administration attention on democracy in Georgia, because it was a very unique time in Georgian history. The reason the time was unique had to do with three different things. One, and having to do with the fact that democracy was actually possible in Georgia as compared to other post-Soviet countries where society was very closed. First, the Georgian president was in his last term in office, and so everyone knew that he had to transition out and someone had to come in. And there was he didn't have a successor. So in the neighboring Azerbaijan, the president was about of the same age, but he was clearly grooming his son to become his successor. We knew that in Ukraine, the president there was also grooming somebody to become his successor, whereas in Georgia, the president didn't appear to be grooming anybody, and that was very important to thinking whether democracy was going to be possible or not. Secondly, Georgia had a very open political environment in that the media was extremely free. There were 3 private TV stations in the country, which made the media very vibrant and very engaging. And there were political parties that were very active, with about 4 political leaders positioning themselves to try to become the successors to the president. And each of them, the leaders had a different political ideology. They had some democratic credentials, and so that was a very positive sign for why democracy might be possible in Georgia. And then thirdly, the civil society was very vibrant. And so for foreigners who really strongly believe in this notion, as I do, that civil society is in some ways determinant whether democracy can work or not, that was a really good sign. You know, the business sector was very strong, the NGOs were very strong, and even the Orthodox Church, which is the dominant church in Georgia, was very pro-democracy. So those 3 factors together, I think, made what I was trying to do, which was to put democracy in the agenda in Washington, a very viable enterprise. And we were also helped somewhat by kind of external factors. After September 11, the Bush administration suddenly became very interested in this idea of democracy abroad and the idea of promoting it. So here were a bunch of us trying to argue that Georgia was a great place to do that, and they had an interest in having countries where they could push democracy. So after about a year and a half of effort, myself and 8 or 9 other people in DC managed to convince the administration that democracy was viable in Georgia and that they should make that an important element of Georgia's relationship with the United States. And that was, I think, critical to everything that happened next, including the Rose Revolution. So in my work in D.C., I had to do a lot of work in Georgia as well, of course, because I would often bring Georgian political leaders to Washington to give lectures and take them to the Hill to meet with people. And through that, I developed a very close relationship with one political leader in particular named David Areshidze, who was a former businessman who had started the first insurance company in Georgia after the Soviet Union collapsed. And he was the leader of kind of the center-right political party in the country. So in 2003, David was getting ready for parliamentary elections that were going to happen that November. These elections were very important because they were kind of like a primary for the forthcoming presidential elections. So if whoever the 2 or 3 leaders were whose parties would do very well in the parliamentary elections would automatically become the kind of pretenders to the throne for the presidential election. So he asked me to come to Georgia and help run his party's campaign. Well, I'm a political junkie, and it was and I had never done a campaign before, so it was a really unique opportunity to be put in a position like that, and probably trusted me more than I would have trusted myself in some ways. But we hired a guy named Mike Murphy, who is a very prominent consultant here in the U.S. to come work with us, and I went to Georgia to do this project, and ended up staying there for about a year working for David on elections, and through that I became virtually. I have a third of my book is about the election process in Georgia in 2003, and I was part of every single discussion that took place with all the other opposition leaders and all the government officials. So I told a lot of secrets that probably a lot of people are not very happy about seeing in print. In addition to David's party, there were about 4 other parties that were competing. It was a government party and 3 other opposition parties. I actually have a sheet somewhere that I was hoping to pass out that lists the names of the different political parties and yeah, perfect. And who they were, because Georgia names are really hard, and so it might be useful for people to have that. Yeah, thank you. So I'm going to skip over the whole election period because of time, and I'm happy to talk about it once I'm done in Q&A. But elections took place in November of 2003, and the opposition did very, very well. In particular, this party called National Movement, which was led by a man named Mikhail Saakashvili, who is now Georgia's president, won about 1/4 of the vote, which was more than anybody had expected. The party that I was working with, the New Rights Party, won about 4% less than we had planned on winning. And that's an interesting experience in itself on why that happened and where we failed in implementing our strategy. We had a really good political strategy and a very bad implementation of that strategy. But what Saakashvili realized that the government was so weak as a result of the elections. As you can see, the For New Georgia, which was the government party, only got about 19% of the vote. That he actually had a chance to take over the country and run the country right off without having to wait for presidential elections. So he wanted to kind of use that as an opportunity to come to power immediately. There are 2 columns or 2 sets of results on this handout. There's the official result published by the Central Election Commission, and then there is a result of what is called the parallel vote tabulations, which were a US-sponsored process done by an NGO where they counted votes in parallel to what the government was doing. The parallel vote tabulation results are the accurate results. The government results are not accurate in that the government then cheated to try to increase its scores and reduce the opposition's. And you can see the difference where, National Movement won about 1/4 of the vote. In the actual vote, they reduced their total by about 6% to 18.5% through different manipulations by canceling certain precincts and then adding votes to the government tally and things like that. And so Saakashvili used the cheating that the government was engaging in as a pretext to bring a lot of people into the streets. And in public, he was demanding, the government must stop cheating, and so we're not going to go home until the government stops cheating. But in reality, and he told me this personally, so I have it on my own authority, his goal was to force Shevardnadze, the president of Georgia, to resign, so that his ally, Nino Burjanadze, who led another opposition party, and she was the speaker of the old parliament, the one whose replacement was being elected, would become the acting president. Because in Georgia there's no vice president, so the head of the legislature becomes president when the president resigns. And a new election is triggered within 45 days. So if Shevardnadze resigned under pressure from about 50,000 people in the streets, then Saakashvili's ally would become president, new elections would take place, and Saakashvili knew that in that environment nobody could challenge him. So he didn't have to worry about the possibility that my boss, David Gampralidze, or a leader of the Labour Party, or even maybe Burjanadze herself would challenge him for office, because nobody would have the popular support in light of the fact that he was in the streets with this mass movement, and it appeared like he was representing the whole country. Because that's what, when you have 50,000 people in the streets, that's what it seems like, even though you might only be speaking for a subset of the population. So on November 22nd, the new parliament convened. Saakashvili refused to attend the new parliamentary session, and instead, while his people were in the streets, a smaller group of his supporters and him marched into the parliament building, broke the doors down, and basically forced Shevardnadze, who was opening the new session, to run away. And this is all happening live on TV. I mean, like with him waving his finger in one hand, and then flowers in another hand, running to a podium trying to get the president to run off, and the president's security guards had to block the Saakashvili from coming on so they could remove the president and leave. And in that environment, there was no choice for Shevardnadze but to resign, because he didn't really have another out anymore at that stage. And that came to be known as the Rose Revolution, which it really was. I mean, it was a very monumental event in Georgian history, and actually in the whole history of democratic transition, I think, because of how it took place and what seemed to be very popular. The West fell in love with this very, very quickly. This was all in Western media. Reporters were enchanted with this idea of people power in the streets. And President Bush, who needed examples of successful democracy promotion, latched onto this and said, Georgia is now democratic. And so then he, a year and a half after the revolution, he went to Georgia and gave a talk to about 200,000 people, declaring, that Georgia was this extremely successful example of democracy transition. Here's a small quote from what he said, you gathered here armed with nothing but roses and the power of your convictions, and you claimed your liberty. And because you acted, Georgia is today both sovereign and free, and this is the most important part, a beacon of liberty to this region and the world. And the beacon of liberty was that Georgia then, in 2003, suddenly in Bush's mind, and in a lot of other Westerners' mind, became the kind of example which other countries followed. So Ukraine had a similar process in 2004, and a lot of supporters of the Georgian Revolution argued that Ukrainians followed the Georgian footsteps. Kyrgyzstan had a similar incident in later in 2004. Again, people argued that this was following the Georgian footsteps. And even when Lebanon had a quote-unquote Seder revolution, that was also allegedly following in the footsteps of the Georgian Rose Revolution. And there's no dispute that this was a very monumentous event, probably the most important political event in the post-Soviet history of most post-Soviet countries since 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed. The reason being that in every other republic of the former Soviet Union, outside of the Baltics, which kind of have a very different history, so in the 12 other republics, political transition happened through what's called managed transition. And Putin's succession to Yeltsin is a prime example of that, where the incumbent president manages his way into giving power to his chosen successor without regard for people's interest and people's will. It's not a very democratic process. So you had that happen in Russia, you had that happen in Azerbaijan. In many other countries, Belarus, Uzbekistan, so forth, transition didn't happen at all, because presidents just stayed in power for consecutive terms and became dictators, in effect. So when you have an environment like that in 11 countries, people in the streets bringing down an allegedly dictatorial guy who's trying to cheat in an election seems like a really cool thing, and it's understandable why people would perceive that as being a monumental event. And it breaks from that pattern. It seems like change was spontaneous, it was bloodless, it was popular with the people, and so I can totally see why everybody fell in love with it. But being back in Georgia and watching all this from there, I had a very different interpretation of things, and I actually thought that it was not democratic at all. And the reason I thought that had to do both with just general conceptions about revolutions and democracy, and how what that tells you about what the relationship between democracy and revolutions is, and then secondly of what actually had happened in Georgia and what the political change meant for democracy. So on the first point, revolutions, we love revolutions oftentimes, and we'd love to talk about them, but historically, there are very few successful revolutions from the perspective of democracy. The American one most certainly is, but if you think of like the French Revolution, which is another very, very famous revolution, it didn't result in democracy at all. It actually resulted in tyranny and a very, very a horrible regime, let's put it that way. Furthermore, they don't really register political opinion, meaning whether they're bloody or not bloody, whether they're peaceful or violent, they are extra-constitutional. They go outside of the political institutions, and so they don't register the majority view and the minority view. There's no way of knowing whether the leader who leads the revolution actually has the support of the majority of the population or not. Well, in Georgia, though, that was not the case. We actually knew how much support the leader of the revolution had, because Georgia had just had an election for parliament, and the guy had gotten 26.6% of the vote. Now, granted, the government tried to reduce his total to 18%, but he was nowhere near a majority support. Then he had another ally who had gotten 10% of the vote, so if you add up that 10% with 26, you end up with about 36, 37% of the vote, which is about a little bit over a third. So the people who were leading the revolution spoke for about, or could claim the mandate of about a third of the population. On the other hand, the four parties that opposed the revolution also had gotten votes, and those votes count too, so to say, and they had the support of about almost a majority, certainly more than the revolutionaries did. So it's very hard, in my view, to argue that the revolution was democratic when the leaders of the revolution had the mandate of about 37% of the population. That was an extremely important piece for my view of what the revolution meant and whether we should call it a democratic revolution or not. And so, for me, it was more like a popular coup. Shevardnadze was very unpopular, no doubt, and even people who opposed the revolution, like I did, were not supporters of Shevardnadze. But the power was usurped through extra-constitutional means, and the removal of the president was popular, but the people who came in by no means had support of the majority of the population, as the elections had just demonstrated. And this is where the Georgian Revolution, I think, differs dramatically from the other sort of famous people power revolutions or experiences. The Philippines is one where, Corazon Aquino was the candidate for president. She won an election. The government tried to take it away from her. She brought people into the streets, and she succeeded in protecting, quote-unquote, the will of the people. Well, she had won a majority support of the population, so all she was doing was defending majority opinion. Same way in Ukraine, a year after the Georgian Revolution, Yushchenko, who is now the president of Ukraine, won the majority of the vote, and the government tried to cheat him out of it, and so he brought 200,000 people into the streets and defended the majority opinion. In Georgia, we didn't have a presidential election, we had a parliamentary election, but the winners of 37% of parliamentary electoral total ended up getting 100% of executive power. And so that is, I think, an extremely big difference between what had happened in Georgia and what had happened in some of these other countries to which Georgia has often been compared. And then secondly, in addition to this kind of general view of why I thought the Georgian Revolution was not democratic, those who praised the revolution, including President Bush and a lot of other observers out in the West, missed or didn't want to think about what was happening in Georgia after the Rose Revolution, and how Georgia moved backward rather than forward in its process of transition to democracy. Specifically, Georgia was the only country in the in the former Soviet Union, in the 12 republics, that didn't have what's called a super presidential system of government. Super presidential system is what you have in Russia, where the president is kind of an omnipotent ruler, and there's a prime minister underneath him, there's a parliament, but it's still underneath him, and he controls both almost the legislative and the presidential, and the executive powers, not just in practice, but almost constitutionally. And so Georgia was an exception to that. The Georgian president was extremely powerful, but was actually not more powerful than the US president. There was a real check on executive power. Well, after the revolution, the first thing that Saakashvili did when he came to power was to amend the constitution to turn it into a super-presidential system of government. Which for me was, a massive, I think what should have been a wake-up call to the world. Secondly, he has governed in the years since in an extremely unliberal manner. I mean, and I don't want to use the term undemocratic because it's not a question of democracy. It's more whether he protects the rights of the people, and he does not. We had, numerous people have been jailed without any charges and kept in jail for 6 months, 9 months at a time without being charged. There is this thing called pretrial detention in Georgia, which is supposed to be used for potential flight risk cases. Well, at one point there were about 8,000 people who were in pretrial detention in a country of 5 million people. And somehow it happened that they were all either rich businessmen or former or political opponents of the president. And so that was, I think, is a huge kind of message as far as what happened in Georgia post the revolution. And then thirdly, this political pluralism that existed in Georgia before the revolution, where you had all these different political parties, you had a free media environment where 3 different private channels competed for viewers and broke stories and did investigative reporting. Well, that all went away too, because the government bought one of the TV stations, or a supporter of the government bought one of the TV stations from its owner, and suddenly the station became a mouthpiece for the government. Then they went and bought another of the 3 TV stations and united them into one company, and the second TV station became a mouthpiece. And the third station, which continued to be semi-free for a long time, suddenly was forced to shut down in 2007. And I'll talk about that in a minute. So pluralism political pluralism also disappeared. So I think both from the perspective of how the revolution happened and what happened afterwards raises very serious doubts about its democratic nature. Now, whenever I say that, and this was especially true from 2003 until about November of 2007, people would come back with this rhetorical claim that, well, but Georgia is still so much better off than all other former Soviet republics. And my usual response is, yes, that's very true, except for Ukraine, where democracy actually has really moved forward since 2004. Georgia is still better off because, well, you have like one opposition party in parliament as compared to none. And there's one private TV station as compared to none. It is better off. But Georgia should be evaluated not from the perspective of, is it better off than other post-Soviet states, but rather, is it better off than it was in 2003? And so if Georgia was here, if democracy is here, Georgia was here, and it was kind of on the way towards real democracy, when it went backwards, even though it still is ahead of other countries, doesn't mean that it is doing better. And so a lot of what I've said had happened post the revolution blew up in 2007, when the opposition parties basically were trying to negotiate with the government over local elections that are supposed to take place, or over parliamentary elections that are supposed to take place in 2008, and negotiations broke down. So the opposition then resorted to the same tools that the president had used in 2003, which is to bring thousands of people into the streets. And so they launched mass movements to force Saakashvili, now the new president of Georgia, this is literally 6 months ago, to try to compromise on how the elections would take place for the next parliament a year later. And unlike Shevardnadze, who could have used force to break up the protests but chose not to in 2003, within a week and a half of protests, Saakashvili sent in armed police, massive force with tanks and guns and platoons to break up the protests. And the world was shocked. The reaction from the West was extremely critical. I don't have the quotes with me, but if you go and look up what people said, they were very, very negative. And for me, it was like, we had 3 years, and this was all happening already in Georgia. You just didn't want to talk about it because it was more important to talk about how Georgia was democratic. And then suddenly a really big thing happened, and it became very prominent and suddenly everybody recognized it. I think part of it was that in Pakistan, the same thing had happened in Pakistan right around then when Musharraf declared a state of emergency and fired the judges. And so when Saakashvili declared a state of emergency and broke up the protests, people were like, Saakashvili seems much more like Musharraf than he does like a Democrat. And so that, I think, kind of closed the chapter on the question of whether the Georgian Revolution was democratic or not and what it meant for Georgian democracy. And a lot of stuff is happening in Georgia since. They had Saakashvili realized how bad the breakup of the protest and the declaration of emergency was, so he actually resigned as a way of kind of changing the subject and triggered new presidential elections, again, ran in them and barely won, with, probably he in reality got 49%, and he used similar tactics to what Georgia has always had when the government tries to cheat, and got 51%, which is what he had to get to win the election. But the question of the Rose Revolution's democratic nature has kind of been answered, I think, and I was in a quagmire in some ways because I was getting a lot of emails telling me that I was very prophetic in what I had said, but it was the kind of time when I didn't want to be prophetic at all because I didn't want to be happy about what had happened. And so that's where Georgia is now, and it's in some ways a very sad story because there was a huge opportunity and it was opportunity lost. I actually almost called the book, Opportunities Lost. But I think it has a lot of lessons for us in the West on what we should and should not do when it comes to democracy promotion. I still really strongly believe in this whole concept that you need to use American and Western power to spread freedom around the world. But the problem that I often find is that we say we're going to do it, but then we implement things really badly. And so I think Georgia is a great case study for how to actually not implement things and how to make sure that things don't fail. So I'll stop at that, and then we can get into more details if people would like doing Q&A.
The floor is now open for questions.
Oh, should Professor Katz, sure.
Directly, what happened to Shevardnadze? He was our great buddy.
Mm-hmm.
Jim Baker brought him to us, and we saw him as a man of reason and gentility, and expected great things from him. What happened?
Well, I personally believe that when in 25 years people write the history of Georgia from 1991 to 2003, which is the time when he ran the country, he will be remembered as the man who saved the country. From Somalia, from becoming like a failed state akin to Somalia. When Shevardnadze came back to Georgia from Moscow, where he had been Soviet foreign minister and then retired in 1992, Georgia was collapsing. There were 3 wars. There was a civil war inside the country, a secessionist war in 2 different provinces in Georgia funded by the Russians, and literally, I was there in Georgia at this point. I was just leaving to come to high school to the States. And Georgia was if you look at it in hindsight, on the way to becoming very akin to Somalia, with armed gangs running around, no government, no civil authority, and basically state of nature in existence. And Shevardnadze, through his sheer willpower and the fact that he was popular in the West and was able to secure support from his friends abroad, brought Georgia from the brink and created a state. And created a state which was, when you compare it to other post-Soviet states, far freer and far more democratic and pluralistic than any other. Now, I don't think that says Shevardnadze was a Democrat. I just think that it said that Shevardnadze was better than other post-Soviet leaders. And that's why there was this opportunity in 2003 or 2001 that I talked about, where in his last couple of years, you could have moved in a direction where he would retire, he'd be hailed as the great savior, and things would move in the right direction as the new generation of leaders would come in. The problem is that not everybody among the new generation leaders wanted that to happen. One in particular was more concerned with gaining power immediately for himself rather than letting the process play through. And so, but I still think that all of Shevanadz's failures, of which there are many, too many to list out, when weighed against the role that he played in saving the country in 1991 to 1995, the latter will far outweigh the former, and that he's going to be regarded as this. I mean, right now there's a debate: will Georgia get into NATO or not? And the Americans and the Brits are fighting with the Germans over that. Well, I mean, the only reason that is even an issue is because Shevardnadze was president of Georgia, and the country actually exists. Because there'd be no country had he not been there. At least that's my view.
There's been some discussion of the possibility of Georgia joining NATO.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess I'd like to comment on it. I find it very difficult to get my head around the idea that the homeland of Joseph Stalin has become a part of NATO.
Sure. So I actually, one of the things I did in Georgia when I was there was create this organization called Georgia for NATO, which is basically not so much a think tank, but like a public advocacy group that has a board of a bunch of businessmen who donate money, and this organization does a bunch of events to promote the idea of NATO membership among the public. So I say that because I'm really, really in favor of Georgia joining NATO, because I think it's good for Georgia, and I think it's good for NATO. It's good for NATO because Georgia is in a very strategic part of the world. It's very close to Iran. It's very close to Turkey. And I think if nothing else, I mean, there are many other reasons, but if nothing else, if things were ever to go badly in Turkey and the U.S. was asked to leave the base there, the Georgian territory could be an extremely convenient replacement for that. And so I think it's in American interest to have Georgia as an ally in the alliance. On the other hand, though, I think that NATO membership should not be given to countries that are not at least semi-democratic and semi-free. And I don't think Georgia today is either semi-democratic or semi-free. So it's the push that the administration has had in the last year to convince the Europeans to have Georgia join NATO, I think has been mishandled in that they didn't use it as a sufficient of a carrot to force the Georgian government to change. And so I think President Bush views getting Georgia into NATO as a legacy issue. If he succeeds in that, then this whole, as my democracy project in Georgia and in Ukraine worked, that'd be the stamp of approval, basically, from the alliance. And so I think they're pushing it, ignoring everything else, and are not using that opportunity to force the government to change, both from the perspective of how the government rules, to how it treats its citizens, to what kind of judiciary it has, and what kind of military it has as far as civilian control and a reformed kind of military force. I mean, one other point in that about that is that in Georgia, NATO is extremely popular. I mean, they did a referendum on NATO membership, and something like 75% of the population said they want to join. So I don't think there's a question of the Georgians are very much in favor of it. We know that the Americans are very much in favor of it. I think the French and the Germans actually have the better of the argument, and that Georgia is not ready because it just is not there as a state. And so I don't really, I'm kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place, because I really don't have an opinion on whether it should be allowed to come in or not, because I see many values of coming in, and I see many problems with it actually happening. So.
I have a concern about, now, as living in USA, I feel like Democratic candidate here has more chance of winning elections, whether over Republican. That's my personal opinion. So what do you think what will happen to current Georgia government if Democrats win in USA who don't have that much international relationships, that kind of things?
Well, I think it depends. So as a full disclosure purposes, A, I love John McCain, and B, I've raised a lot of money for Senator Clinton. That, as far as my allegiances, the Georgia-U.S. relationship project, so to say, started under President Clinton. It was built around this thing called the Caspian Sea oil pipeline that goes through Georgia and moves the oil that is in the Caspian Sea out to the west through Georgia and then Turkey. And there are many people who are very close to both of the Clintons who are extremely good fans of Georgia. So I think if Senator Clinton were to win the nomination and then go on to win the presidency, there'll be very little to no change in the relationship, because I think that the people who will be making European policy in the Clinton administration will have a very similar view to this current administration as far as Georgia is concerned. Now, maybe McCain would be stronger of a friend to Georgia than Senator Clinton is, just because he cares about foreign policy more and he knows more about Georgia personally. I mean, he's been there like 6 or 7 times, and he's met with a lot of the foreign leaders and opposition leaders and the government and so on. But I don't think the policy will be that different. In a potential of an Obama administration, I have no idea. I mean, I personally think that, well, I won't go there. I think there's no need to. But yes, I would agree that it would probably suffer.
Would you characterize and contrast the position of the government and of the opposition in Georgia? What would be the differences of the opposition and the government?
On foreign policy, not very many, actually, because there's an overall, I mean, the debate is on who is more pro-Western than who is less pro-Western. There is no such thing as a pro-Russian political party in Georgia, which is also actually unique. In a lot of Soviet states, you have a force that is pro-Russian and then a force that is pro-Western, and they fight it out. There is now an alliance of all the opposition parties in Georgia but one that is led by my 2 old bosses that is fighting the government. And they are far more radical now than they were then when I was in Georgia. And I personally don't approve of that radicalism. And what worries me is that they're now much less concerned with how to govern and more with paying back Saakashvili for all the bad things that he's done. So the same way that when Saakashvili came to power, he quote-unquote paid back the Shevardnadze officials by arresting them, punishing them, you know, blah, blah, rather than reconciling with them and letting it be and moving on. I'm afraid that when these guys come to power now, they'll want to do the same thing. They'll want to arrest, punish, take money away from, and so forth, rather than saying, what was, now let's build from here. And so the debate is more over like, you're really bad, no, you're really bad, rather than what do I want to do for the country. And I think that's a problem. What attracted me to the people I worked with in Georgia in 2003 is that I actually had a plan, like I had a vision for where Georgia should be economically, what kind of a very libertarian plan as far as like government's relationship vis-a-vis business and individual and tax policy and kind of the economic environment. And none of that is now front and center. What's front and center is we hate Saakashvili because he's evil and let's bring him down. And I think that's a huge problem. And it's kind of sad.
I have a question. Do you see any clear parallels in the way Saakashvili is treated like oligarchs such as Battery, who of course was initially poisoned in London in February?
Yep.
Of course, he was like a huge supporter of the opposition.
Mm-hmm.
Tried to run this presidential candidate in Florida in January. And how Battery's treatment was comparison to Putin's treatment for Novosti and Belarus in Russia. And do you feel that big business has a chance to help the cause of democracy?
Yeah, that's a great question. So you know more about Georgia than probably anybody else does here, and you just mentioned some names, so I'll just explain who they are. Badri Parakashvili is a now deceased Georgian who was worth anywhere between $4 and $12 billion. He and Berezovsky, who is a very famous Russian oligarch, who were business partners, and together with a few other Russian oligarchs, they basically brought Putin to power. They made the deal with the Yeltsin family to give Yeltsin the protection that he got as a result of resigning and placing Putin into office. When Putin came into office, he went after the same oligarchs who brought him to power, and so Badri, being Georgian, moved to Georgia. Now, whether he was worth $4 or 12 billion, he was still worth about 1,000 times more, or maybe 10,000 times more, than the richest Georgian who made money in Georgia, just because the country is 5 million versus Russia's 200 million, and the size of the industry is much larger. And so he funded every single opposition political party, Saakashvili's, ours, everybody else's. He funded the media. It was like this, he wanted to, I think, be kind of the behind-the-scenes Berlusconi rather than the Berlusconi up front running for office. At least that's where he was in the early part of this decade. I had met with him many times and presented campaign strategy to him, and I always wondered how a man who was that dumb could have made as much money as he did. It was actually, to be honest, that experience was one of the reasons why I ultimately decided to never want to be in Georgian politics long term again, because you would be dependent on people like that for success, rather than a country like America, where even though we go after quote unquote lobbyists that give $2,300 rather than 2.5 million of the 5 million you might need to raise to run for office. And so he then, he actually was instrumental in bringing Saakashvili to power, because he paid for the revolution. To have 50,000 people in the streets for 3 weeks doesn't come cheap. It costs a lot of money, because you have to feed them, you have to pay agitators to drag people into the streets and all this other stuff. He paid for all that, along with George Soros. But then there was a break between the government and him over various issues, largely because someone being worth as much money as he was and wanting to be powerful was getting in the way of the government, no matter who the government was. And so he decided to fund the new opposition to the new government, and was, I guess, pushing his own agenda. Now, I don't think he was poisoned. I think he died from natural causes. I don't really buy the idea that he was poisoned. And I don't think even his family has alleged that, and I think it would have had there been real evidence for that. But on the larger question of business's role in democracy, I think I have a whole chapter about that, actually, in that I very strongly believe that business contributes dramatically to development of democratic institutions in transitional countries. A reason being that there are two things that I think really matter, or three things that really matter for democracy to happen in a transitional country. One is free media, two is political parties, and three is political institutions that allow for that to happen. Well, the business can't really do much about the third one, but it can do a lot about the first two. The reason Georgia had 3 different private TV stations, which were vibrant and functional, is because business paid for them. They were all losing money, but the business community would basically overpay for advertisements far more than they were worth for the 30-second ads in order to make sure that they were on the air. Now, granted, they all had their own agendas, and certain stations protected certain business people and other stations protected other business people, but that's still much better than not having TV stations at all, because even when the business people have different opinions, they clash it out and it all comes out into the public eye, and that really helps kind of pluralism. And second, they pay for political parties. They pay for the political parties to exist and to operate, and they did that in Georgia to a very large extent, and I think that really helps democracy as well. Unfortunately, in the West, we don't count business as part of civil society. Now, that's going to sound strange to anyone who's read Hegel, because in Hegel, from where the whole concept of civil society, the way we know it today, is, business is a huge element of civil society. It's at the core. But in modern day, like if you go to a think tank in DC that works in democracy promotion, and you mention the idea that business is part of civil society, they'll like flip out and get very upset, because a lot of Westerners view business as a poison in democracy and in these developing countries, because these are oligarchs and these are bad guys. Well, I have a very different point of view. I think that even though they might be oligarchs and they have their own personal interests, they ultimately prefer a system of rule of law to a lawless society once they make the money. And so I think there's a huge lesson that we can learn from the Georgian experience, from the Ukrainian experience too. I mean, in Ukraine, where things have gone much better since the Orange Revolution than they have in Georgia since the Rose Revolution. The business community was instrumental in making that happen, and still is, to making the country move in the right direction. So I think that's a really interesting topic to explore more. Press.
Exactly. I've been enjoying your presentation a great deal. And thank you for coming back. I have a question concerning the regions of Abkhazia and Ajaria and South Ossetia, which have served as a point of confrontation between Russia and Georgia.
Yeah.
If you could say a few words
Of course.
about where the conflict is going. Just one question or point of fact kind of observation. You made several references to how Georgia has done better than any post-Soviet republic, perhaps with the exception of the Ukraine. But I think you're setting aside the Baltic.
I am, yes, totally. They're like, I'm just talking about the 12 that,
Okay,
yeah.
I just wanted to make
Oh, yeah,
sure
no.
that was not included.
No.
I have some students here, so I want them to
Yes,
understand
yeah.
that the Baltics are out there.
Yeah.
Way ahead.
Yeah. No, when I say the word post-Soviet, I refer to 12 countries, not including the 3 Baltic states, because the experience of the 3 Baltic states was very different. They were taken over by the Soviets in 1945-46 after World War II, and they had way less of a communist history. And so they were much more like East European countries, versus the other 12 had a very unique history of their own, and so it's very different. Georgia had, under the Soviet Union, 3 what were called autonomous republics, Adjara, Ossetia, and Abkhazia, which Professor Krause mentioned. The autonomous republics concept was a Soviet application of a divide and rule theory, so that they would divide up the republics with these little enclaves as a way of controlling the states in case there was ever a pro-independence movement in that particular republic, because they would then have ways of agitating people in these minority communities to try to rebel against the central government inside a particular republic, which is exactly what the Russians did when Georgia declared independence in 1990. So among these 3, there were secessionist problems in all 3, although Adjara was much less than the other 2. Abkhazia and Ossetia are on the Russian border, and there was much more of a... I mean, they are basically de facto independent entities now. One of this current government's great success, I think, has been Adjara, where they removed a really nasty ruler and brought that part of the country back into the fold, and that's a huge success that I think they deserve a lot of credit for, which Shevardnadze never did. On the other ones, though, I think that Russia has zero interest in either Abkhazia or Ossetia. A lot of people in the West view like, well, the Russian generals under Soviet times would go to vacation in Abkhazia because it's on the Black Sea coast, and so they have this, like, in their heart, a desire to have it be part of their country. I really don't buy that. I think it's nothing but a political tool against the Georgian government, because Russia does not want a pro-Western, strong country on their southern border. Now, I personally think that's bad for Russia. I think it would benefit Russia to have a strong, stable country on their southern border, because they have such great issues in their southern provinces, Chechnya being just one example, but there are many other small republics like Chechnya that could blow up at any point because they have minority populations that really don't like the Russians very much. But I think that it's more of an argument between almost America and Russia in terms of what happens in Abkhazia than between Georgia and Russia. And that's if the issue is going to be resolved peacefully, only under U.S. pressure will it be resolved peacefully. In other words, if U.S. forces Russia to accommodate. Now, I personally think that what the Georgian government should do is fight. I mean, yes, nonviolent is good, and you don't want to have violence, but there are things short of a full-fledged war that the Georgians can do to reclaim sovereignty. As a very simple example, I think they should follow the model of kibbutzes in Israel, in Palestine, and create small enclaves in Abkhazia in areas that are not under anybody's control now, and then push them more into the Abkhazian territories over time and fund them, because I think that would be a very strong message to both the Russians and the local authorities there that we actually plan on taking over this territory.
Build settlement.
Yeah. Why don't Professor then go next, because she hasn't asked yet? Yeah.
Yeah, just a quick question. I was in Prague last year and I heard George Soros speak.
Mm-hmm.
And I was amazed to learn, at least according to him, that he was paying the salaries of most of the civil servants in Georgia.
Yes.
Could you say a little bit about how that developed and how long he's been paying the salaries? And
Sure.
what the present status is?
Yes. So George Soros has in some ways done a very great thing, which is to put his wealth for work in promoting democracy. And he has this massive network of foundations called the Open Society Foundation Network that is based in different countries and that funds democratic organizations, civil society entities, things like that. The problem is that these entities are run extremely, completely locally with very little oversight from the central Soros organization in New York. But they get a lot of money. And so what happened in Georgia is that the Georgian Open Society Foundation was taken over by certain elements of the opposition and was used to advance its interests. So instead of promoting democracy, the massive money, I mean like $30–40 million a year, was being used to advance a particular party's interest. And it was the national movement's interest. So, they paid for a lot of advertisements that were almost like, independent groups in the United States paying for ads against the government or against President Bush on behalf of national movement. They never supported national movement publicly, but they were paying for ads to send the same message as what national movement was sending. And so Soros legitimately deserves a great deal of credit for the Rose Revolution because he paid for a lot of the processes that led to it, and then he paid directly for people in the streets because a lot of the NGOs that were mobilizing people to come out in the streets were being funded by George Soros. So after the Rose Revolution, he became quite engaged in funding the new government. And so they established salaries for, or like grants for ministers and other officials through this foundation because the Georgian government salaries are very low. So the idea was that if you pay them, $3,000 a month, which is probably 300 times more than an average person makes, they might be less inclined to take bribes. And I don't know if that is still happening. I would guess probably not anymore. I haven't really dwelled into that issue in the last 2 or 3 years since I wrote the book, and I don't really know what the relationship between Soros and the Georgian government now is, and whether they get along anymore or not. I would actually guess that they probably don't very much, because for all of Soros's faults, he actually recognizes when things go wrong, and then it becomes very critical of them. Because he supported Shevardnadze for a while too, and then just realized Shevardnadze was really not doing very well, and so started to oppose him. In the book, I describe an incident when David and I were in the U.S. in the summer of 2003, and we were asked to meet with Soros. And so I was in New York, and we had an hour-and-a-half long meeting with him when he pushed for all the opposition parties to be united into one, because he wanted to force change against Shevardnadze, and he felt correctly that if all the opposition parties united and ran as one party in the elections, they would do much better, and a revolution would be possible. Now, a revolution was still possible, even without that happening, but he was very strong in that belief, and he got his way. Thank you.
I have a question, since you are expert on the NATO and Georgia, let's say. My question would be, let's say Georgia joins NATO.
Yep.
Would it facilitate or boost democratic reforms and it become more democratic, let's say, would be on the right track? I'm referring to our big neighbor, Georgia's
Mhm.
neighbor, Turkey,
Yep.
which joined, I don't know, I mean, you probably know when he joined Turkey.
1960, yeah.
And what was the democracy situation in Turkey then, and what's now? So, I mean,
Oh,
NATO would help to expedite the
sure.
process in Georgia rather than waiting and making it until.
And of course, and what is on the agenda now is not joining NATO. It's on granting Georgia what's called Membership Action Plan, MAP, and it's like a 5-year process under which the country has to undergo certain reforms to qualify for membership. So there's a very strong case to be made that if you give Georgia a map now, and it's very specific, and you have to meet these certain criteria for membership, the government will have to act on them to make it happen, and that's the administration argument. I think it has, it's a valid argument. I just think that you could even use the carrot of granting MAP as a way of forcing some change in the beginning. But yes, I agree. I mean, Turkey, I think, is a great example of democratic change over time, because I actually think Turkey is doing very well in democracy. And it'd be great if the same thing happened in Georgia. I just don't want it to take 30 years.
We can take one more
Okay.
question. We're actually just about out of time.
Yeah,
One more
go
question.
ahead.
I'm very keen to know what are the states of relations between Georgia and Russia? Maybe people to people, but also government to government?
Yeah, so people to people, relationships are generally very good. Georgians always get along with Russians and vice versa. There are about 500 to 750,000 Georgians that live in Russia today. It's kind of like Mexicans living in America almost and sending money back to Georgia. Some of the wealthiest people in Russia are Georgian. If you go down the list of Russian billionaires, there'll be 4 or 5 Georgian names on it, which is a lot for a very small country. But government relationships, on the other hand, are horrible. I mean, it's like almost like as close to a state of war as you can have without actually shooting at each other. And there's reasons for why, because Russia ultimately does not in any way promote policies that are in Georgian interests. And the Georgian government, for all its faults, is trying to defend its country from someone who would rather see it as weak, in shambles, and ideally as part of Russia. So.
Thank you very much for a really